Buongiorno. Mi chiamo Stefano Sireci, and I hope I pronounced that correctly. Because although I am coming today from the United States, from the University of Massachusetts Amherst, my family roots are from Bellizzi, a small town outside of Avellino, and from Caltagirturo, a small town outside of Palermo. So I stand here before you today as an example of the importance of the work of Dante Alighieri, Clique, and other organizations that are preserving the language and preserving the culture, because it's so important compared to 100 years ago when my family emigrated, and acculturation was based on assimilation and not valuing the language as much. So I think it's important to pause and realize the real honor for me today is to be in a room of people who are using language to provide opportunity rather than to put up barriers, and to be in a room full of people who are using language to support cultures rather than to forget about language and culture. So it's a real honor and a pleasure to be part of this conference. The topics I've been asked to talk about today are, I'm going to talk about alignment within the context of a project we've started at UMass called the English Test for Adults. So we'll talk about that project. What is the English Test for Adults? And I'll use that as an example to talk about the importance of alignment as validity evidence. I should say from the beginning, the English Test for Adults, we're doing work in the context of adult education. So in the United States, we have, of course, the public and the private school system for children up through high school. But for people who don't graduate high school, who fall out of the educational system, or for immigrants who come in at an older age, there's adult education. And that's the context I'll speak of today. I'll also talk about what is alignment and how does it relate to content validity, and specifically how do we gather and evaluate and summarize alignment data. I'll talk about future research directions and also the use of artificial intelligence, but I think the presentation from Prof. Sireci gave us a much better picture of what technology will do for the future of assessment. I'm going to draw from my talk from some standards and guidelines that already exist. There's the Standards for Educational and Psychological Testing that go back to 1954, actually. They're available in English and Spanish for free on the web if you Google them. And also, what I spoke about yesterday, the guidelines for technology-based assessments from the International Test Commission. I'm here also representing the International Test Commission, which is a global organization of testing professionals and researchers. And I'll invite you to join with us in Granada this summer for our summer 2024 in July for our next conference. And of course, the ALTE Principles of Good Practice is another valuable resource for understanding alignment and validity research. Now, I've got more slides that I can cover in the time I have, so if you see me speeding through them, don't worry about it. But some articles that you can get, which this talk is based on. This is basically an overview of validity theory. It's available for free on the web if you just Google that. It's available in English and Chinese. Then also, this is more recent. This is a kind of a how-to guide for gathering validity evidence, and this is in a journal out of Spain called Psychothema. It's also open access, and this is in English. There's an older version, there's an older article in the same journal that's specifically on validity evidence based on test content. And I won't talk, when we talk about alignment, a bit older, is different techniques for evaluating alignment. I can send you this one if you can't find it. And sometimes we think of alignment in terms of benchmarking or standard setting. I'm not going to talk so much about that today, but this article talks about regardless of the method you use, how do you evaluate the validity of the benchmarks you've set. Okay, so the English Test for Adults. I'm going to say a few words about that, and I want to point out for those of you who are psychometric geeks that yes, that second letter is an ADA. Okay, so we've got an ADA in the title as well as the acronym. So I hope that impresses at least 2 or 3 of you in the room today. Because to change the keyboard to make sure an ADA was in there was you know, a few seconds. Okay, so an overview of the ADA. So like many tests that are developed, there's some type of law or policy that generates the need for the test. So our goal is to develop high-quality reading, writing, speaking, and listening tests for adult English learners in Massachusetts. This is funded by the state of Massachusetts. But any state that receives funding from the federal government has to be aligned with the National English as a Second Language curriculum standards and tied to the federal government's achievement levels for adults. So that's as a starting point, the ADA has to be aligned to federal accountability. So when we design the purposes of the ADA, we want to measure adult English learners, the acronym EL, English learners, knowledge and skills in the 4 domains of reading, writing, speaking, listening, measure their gains as they progress through their educational programs, and as part of that, providing information to teachers that will allow them to respond to what they know about the student and adjust instruction accordingly. So action is a key word there. Then, of course, we have the 4th, provide information that can be used for federal accountability. So our theory of action around the ADA is to provide information. We believe that assessment has an important role in helping students learn, in helping adults gain English proficiency. So our theory of action is that by providing information on their skills, will help them gain the proper education and training they need to accomplish their academic and career goals. So for adults, we're not just thinking academic, but also their workplace and employment prospects. And at the get-go, we want to say that the test needs to be accessible to all learners, value adult learners' funds of knowledge, so learners who are coming from very different backgrounds and cultures, what can they draw from their culture that will help them demonstrate their proficiency during the assessment? Provide scaffolds and supports when they're needed, and again, the end result is providing information that they and their teachers can take action on. So theories of action always look better in pictures, right? It's a very simple theory of action. Everything starts with the learner. Starts with the learner who might be an employee that interacts with our assessment system, and then based on that interaction, information is provided that informs the learner, the teacher, a counselor, an employer, and based on that information, there's some action that takes place. It might be further education or training, maybe they're certified or promoted or hired, and then we have the culturally sustaining assessment principles that underlie the ADA assessment system. Should also point out, we're building it. This is not a test that exists yet. It will be operational in 2026. Come on, there we go. It's also part of the Adult Skills Assessment project, which is a project that we have at UMass, again in the context of adult education, where a test doesn't exist until 2 things happen. The learner presents himself to the assessment situation, and all the characteristics that we know about that learner dictate the type of assessment that will be produced, as well as the purpose of the assessment. It might be for placement, it might be for diagnosis, it might be for workplace, or for another purpose. So once we know the purpose and we know the characteristics of the learner, it produces a test that feeds an information system that provides information back to the learner, the employer, the counselor, whoever, that allows them to accomplish their goals. So you see the word alignment here for the first time because one of the goals is to align both academic knowledge and skills that are needed in the workplace. Getting back to the ADA, so this is, I won't go through all the test specifications, you're familiar with the process. This is just for the reading part of the assessment. One of our challenges, we're trying to align to both state and federal standards. So the modality part, interpretive and interactive, comes from the federal, and then the standards, focus on meaning, organization, and style components of English come from the state. And what we have in the columns are educational functioning levels, and that's the federal government's achievement level descriptors of the lowest levels, 1 through 6. And they evaluate state programs by students advancing from one level to the next. So what you see in typical test specifications is the proportion of content that will be devoted to these different intersections of standard and modality, and how they change across educational functioning level. One interesting feature is that for reading, the reading specifications have the same interactive component, and then of course it's not interpretive, it's productive, right, for writing. But if you take both the reading and the writing, then you actually get a reading, writing, and interactive score. So alignment is actually the glue that holds all of this together. It holds the system together in that we're aligning across state and federal content standards. We're aligning across workplace and academic. And what I'm going to focus on is how we methods for evaluating that alignment and for building that alignment in. So I just want to point out that alignment data provide validity evidence, right? So what we're talking about, we could say alignment, how well is the test aligned to curriculum standards and so forth. But that's an important part of validity evidence in general, because if you don't have the content of the test right, if your test is not measuring the right knowledge and skills that you're targeting, then what kind of a test do you have? So with respect to validity and alignment, if we start with what is validity, right? Validity is not something inherent about this test, but the degree to which we have theory, but also evidence that the test is justifiable for the purposes for which we use it. So the degree to which we have evidence and theory to support the interpretations and the uses of the test scores. So the standards for educational and psychological testing describe 5 sources of validity evidence, the first being test content, and that's where we actually situate the alignment evidence. Content validity is kind of a broader term than alignment. It's the degree to which the content of the test is congruent with the testing purposes. And we could break it down into 4 elements. How the domain is defined. How do we define English proficiency? How well does the test represent that definition of the domain? How relevant are the items in the task to the domain? And what about the test construction procedures? Everything Claudia talked about, right? Really thinking about how do we have evidence in what we're doing that supports the information, the evidence that the content is fulfilling the purpose for which we've developed the test. Alignment is a kind of a particular angle on validity evidence based on test content. And in the United States, we're very influenced by Webb, who talked about the degree to which the expectations for student performance and the assessments are in agreement and guide the whole system of assessment and learning towards students learning what they're expected to know and do. So alignment studies provide validity evidence based on test content, evidence regarding the degree to which the content of the test is congruent with the testing purposes, but also can go a bit further to talk about the alignment of instruction and how well the instruction is aligned with assessment and the effects of assessment on instruction, which is, we can think about providing validity evidence based on testing consequences too, or which in the language testing field you might describe as washback. So if we think about the importance of proper assessment to inform teaching and learning, we think about alignment of curriculum, instruction, and assessment. In between the curriculum and the assessment, we have test specifications. So that's where we kind of think about the domain. First of all, how is the domain defined? In many cases, we have curriculum, we have standards, we have the CEFR or whatever. What do we think about the definition of that domain? Does that have validity? Does that have consensus there? So that's part of validity evidence based on test content. And then when we talk about how we operationalize that domain in the form of test specifications, and then how well the assessment matches those specifications, that's the domain representation part. How do we get evidence there? And I'll talk about that primarily today, those particular links of domain representation. And then when we look at the assessment, are the tasks we're asking people to do relevant to instruction, relevant to the workplace, and so forth. So these are how we kind of think about the different components of validity evidence based on test content and how these are all aligned together. And the test construction procedures, if we think about all the quality control that we build into test construction, all the work that you and your colleagues are doing to making sure the test is as valid as possible, also provides important evidence. So just an example, I won't get into this too much because you can't really see it probably, but there's a reading standard from the Massachusetts English Language Proficiency Standard that talks about how it's differentiated across levels. So when we're writing items and tasks, we want to make sure we're aligned to this. And the evidence that we're going to get to demonstrate that, yes, we actually are, the assessment and the items that are on the assessment actually are, and they're not just written to these standards, but we have evidence that they are aligned to them. I'll just briefly talk about standard setting. In addition to being aligned to curriculum standards, students' performance on the ADA has to be classified into federally established educational functioning levels. So they're not aligned to the CEFR, but you can think about it in the same way, different levels of English language proficiency. So alignment to those performance levels is needed, and as I think both previous presentations pointed out, it's often called standard setting. I will not talk about that type of alignment today, but happy to talk about that some other time. So here we have an example of some of the federal education functioning levels that talk about what students can do at the different levels, and in addition to demonstrating alignment to the content standards that are associated with these, we will also have to have cut scores that demonstrate students can do these things based on their test performance. And I'm sure many of you can relate to that because it's similar to what you're doing in your language assessments. Okay, so now I've talked about what we have to do. It's a lot, right? We have to show alignment to curriculum standards at the state level, at the federal level. We have to demonstrate their alignment to workplace readiness, workplace skills, and then we have to also have standard setting. So we can kind of see where we need to go, but how do we get there? So what I'm going to talk about for the next few moments is methods. So methods for evaluating content validity, methods for gathering alignment evidence. They all involve some common things, and one is subject matter experts. So a lot of psychometricians don't like to get into content validity alignment because they have to get away from the computers and analyzing data and actually talk to real people, right? So we need to engage the field, and we saw examples of that from Claudia's presentation, all the teachers she worked with in Cuba and across Germany. So subject matter experts review what's on the test. They review the task, they review the items, and what do? We have to structure their task to gather their judgmental data. So the rating form, the task you give them, is really important. You want it to be simple that they can understand it, but also provides quality information about test content. And then the other component that all methods involve are how do we summarize the data to report back an index of the quality of the alignment. So that's what I'll be talking about today. And when we evaluate the methods, one is how long does it take? You might have a great method, but if it's going to take 2 or 3 or 4 days and you have to pay people, maybe it's not going to be very useful. So efficiency of the method, how complex are the judgments? We can't have judgments that are so complex that the subject matter experts can't understand what they're supposed to do. And then also, what about response biases? Like we might think we're getting good judgments, but they're just trying to please us. They're just trying to show us that they understand what we're trying to measure, not what we're actually measuring. So social desirability and response biases are a really important potential confounding factor in some methods. And then also, how much validity evidence do the methods provide? So I want you to think about these as we go through the methods, and I'm going to start with very simple methods and very simple ways of summarizing the data that can be very powerful and informative. So types of content validity rating tasks. So at the simplest level, we have congruence ratings, right? A couple of variations. One is matching. and the other is rating. Matching, you just have them match the items to a category, and rating, you provide a rating scale. So as an example of matching, match each test item to the objective, the content area, the skill you believe it measures. On the rating form of this, you could say rate the degree to which each item measures the objective, or how well each item measures it. So let's start with the simplest possible task, matching. So you have items. I just have 1, 2, 3 because it's PowerPoint. Not a lot fits on there. Item 1, is it measuring reading, listening, or speaking? If you don't have good data agreement from subject matter experts at this level, then you really have to go back to the drawing board and say something about your assessment, right? Or you can have an objective, for example, infer a word meaning from context, rate each item with respect to some rating scale. Here we see a 3-point rating scale, how well each of these items is measuring that particular objective. Note now we've indicated what the items are supposed to measure, this particular objective. So if we think about these two approaches, the advantage of the matching task is you're not telling them which area the item is supposed to measure. They have to pick it. I mean, they are informed of the domains. And it's a simpler task. But the example of the rating task is you're not just getting whether they think it's measuring this, but how well it's measuring it. So you're getting a bit more information there. You can take that a step further with a longer scale. For example, please rate the relevance of each item to either an objective it's measuring, where you tell it, the subject matter experts, which objective is being measured, or to all the objectives. If you do it to all the objectives, then you have the hypothesis that the item is going to be rated most relevant to the item, to the objective it's been written to measure. So just an example there. Here you have like a 9-point rating scale, all the items to all the objectives. And there are different ways to summarize these data. So here you see some examples. Some of them can be very simple, like the majority or 70%. If 70% of the experts all agree the item's measuring this, or rate an item highly, then you could say, okay, that we'll consider that item to be meeting its objective, to be congruent with its objective. And there are some statistical formulas in the literature that you can use also. Most of those are really consensus statistics, like are the judges all agreeing with a certain level of consensus? Above chance consensus. But I just want to take a couple moments to share some very simple content validity data that came out of an alignment study we did in Massachusetts. These are sort of real data. They're real data, but they come from a math test, and I just changed the domains because we're talking about language proficiency here. But what these data come from, there are 352 items from a computerized adaptive item bank. So we're changing from looking at a particular test to looking at the alignment of all the items that are in a bank from which tests are produced for any particular learner who interacts with the system. Okay, so you see in the first domain, we'll call it reading, there are 89 items. There are 85 writing items, 102 listening items. So we had 6 subject matter experts review these items and classify them into one of the domains. And for example, if let's take the listening domain there, because there's 102 items, so it's almost like 100. So 80% of those items were classified as congruent. So about 80 out of the 102. 50% of the items were classified as unanimous. So what do we mean by that? So the criteria we came up with, if all 6 subject matter experts put the item in the same category, and that category was what the item was written to, that's unanimous, right? So that item is classified as unanimously being aligned with the domain. If the majority, 4 out of 6 of the subject matter experts, match the item to its intended domain, we consider that congruent, right? So of the 80 listening items that were congruent, 50 of them were also unanimous. So if you look at these data, what does it say about this test, right? How is reading holding up? How is writing holding up? Listening and speaking. Does anybody want to make a comment or an interpretation of what they see? If we had a bit more time, I might let that question hang. But what you could see is, well, for reading, writing, listening, we've got congruence ratings of 80% of the items or more. For reading, 94% of the items seem to be congruent, or were classified as congruent based on the subject matter experts' perceptions of the items and our criteria. Speaking, not so good. About half the items weren't even congruent. Only 22% of the items were unanimously rated as measuring speaking. So just an example of how some simple tasks from external people outside the testing organization who are experts in the area can provide important evidence about the alignment of the quality of the content. So if we think about some of the advantages and disadvantages of the methods I've described so far, these congruence ratings, match the item are pretty quick and easy for people to do. We can have subject matter experts go through 200 or 300 items in a day. Calculations are simple, they're easy to understand, but they don't give us information about how well the item's measuring a domain or an objective. So for example, a subject matter expert might say, yes, this is measuring reading, but not very well. You wouldn't get it out of that method, because they would just classify it as reading. There's also can be this expectancy bias in that you're actually showing them what the domains that you're measuring, and there's no statistical index of item quality. Relevance rating, you're getting a bit more information, like how well is it measuring that, because you're using a rating scale, and there are some statistical indices that can be used. It's a bit more work, because now I'm not just matching it, but I have to think, how well is it actually measuring this? But it's not overly complex, it's just a bit more time consuming. It could be a little harder to compute and explain, but there's still this expectancy or social desirability if you're telling them what you're measuring and say, how well are we doing? And if you're paying them, they might just want to, what we've learned from experimental psychology and research methodology, there are these kind of social desirability expectancy effects that people want to please the experimenter. So we do worry about that. One way to get around that is to not tell them what you're measuring and just have them rate the similarity of items to one another. This method is not as popular, but it looks something like this. And you would give them the whole item, so these are multiple choice items, but because of PowerPoint, I'm not putting the whole item on the screen. But how similar are these two items with respect to what they're measuring? That's the task. You're not giving them any test specification, you're not telling them anything. And the theory behind this approach is items that are designed to measure the same objective, the same domain, will be rated more similar than items that are measuring differences in different domains, different objectives. So it's a very spatial interpretation. We analyze there's the logic there. Items that are designed to measure the same will be perceived as more similar. And you think about this spatially. Like how might this look on a map? Would a spatial representation of these types of perceptions, we're trying to get in the minds of the subject matter experts who are looking at the content, would that map onto the test specifications? The spatial dimensions in their perceptual space, do they map on to the dimensions in the test specifications? So there's no social desirability there. We analyze the data using multidimensional scaling, which I won't get into. But basically, it's how do we portray the items based on the subject matter expert's judgments in a perceptual space. The nice thing about multidimensional scaling is it's pictorial. So I'll show you just an example of the output. This example I'm going to show you comes from a science test where we had 15 science teachers from across the United States rate science items on the National Assessment of Educational Progress. And I'm just going to show you, this is, we actually needed 5 dimensions to represent their perceptions. And what you're looking at here is 2 dimensions that we derive from their data. And what you're looking at are 45 items that are projected across these 2 dimensions. And the horizontal dimension is basically separating the lower order cognitive skills. So if you see a C, that's conceptual understanding, from the higher order scientific reasoning skills like practical reasoning and scientific investigation. So not by telling them what we were measuring, just how similar are the items. The first dimension that characterized their data, separated the items across the cognitive domains. It's not perfect, and some of the items, based on other ratings that they did, were misclassified. Like some of those items that are labeled practical reasoning were not very good practical reasoning items that were judged as conceptual understandings. But the fact that you see a space between those kind of like clusters on the left and clusters on the right gave some support for the cognitive test specifications. When we looked at the higher dimensional space, now I'm going to show you dimensions 4 and 5, we started to see clusters of items based on their judgments be pulled apart based on life science, earth science, and physical science, which was the other dimension in the test specification blueprint. So it's kind of an interesting method. Takes a bit more time, a lot more time, but you get a lot more data out of it, and it gets around the problem of the social desirability. So there are the pros and cons. You've solved the problem of social desirability. If you're concerned about that, you've got a visual interpretation. You don't have a statistical index, which it's a lot more time consuming, right? So 45 items now in a day rather than 200 or 300. Can be difficult to interpret, and the data analysis now is not straightforward. You need someone who knows how to analyze the data using multidimensional scaling or something like that. Okay, so I've talked a lot about content validity methods, some of the alignment methods. There are different methods specifically for alignment to fulfill federal accountability requirements in the United States. There's some references there on that. The web methodology is the most popular. They have things like categorical concurrence, where they're matching the items to the benchmark. But there's also what they call depth of knowledge consistency, that's focusing on the cognitive levels, but not just of the items. They first rate the cognitive levels of the objectives. And then they categorize the objectives into cognitive levels, and then the items into cognitive levels, and look at that match. And now there's also, if you're going to have benchmarks, how many items that were rated aligned are actually also specified to measure that benchmark. And you should have a certain number of items before you can make a claim about what a student can do, how evenly distributed are the items across objectives, and so forth. So to explain all these criteria would take more time than we have today. But what I'll do is give you an example of the rating form we used in an alignment study. It says recent, but 2016 seems like yesterday, that we did in Puerto Rico. So out of 3 presentations today, 2 are giving you results from the Caribbean. So what you see here, basically it was a rating sheet we gave them. The rows are items, right? So you see in the first, well, maybe you can't see. The first column is the item number. The second column is the content area it was supposed to measure. And what we have here, this is all Spanish, but again, it's a science test: biology, physics, earth science, and so forth. And then the next column, they indicate yes or no whether the item's measuring that focus area. So we've told them what it's supposed to be measuring. Is it? And then the next column, you have the standard, the objective that's being measured. And then you have a 4-point rating scale. How well is the item measuring that standard? And then the last 4 columns is the cognitive level. So we're getting 3 ratings for each item. Is it measuring the standard? Is it measuring the domain? How well is it measuring the objective? And what's the cognitive level? So based on those 3 pieces of information, we came up with 7 criteria for evaluating alignment. That's what the columns in this table are. And these were 24 different tests, because we went from 3rd grade to high school in science, math, Spanish, and English as a second language. So I'm trying to summarize all of that in one table in a PowerPoint. But just to show you, we're looking at, across the criteria for each grade level, we can compute what was the success level with respect to meeting these 7 criteria. And we could also evaluate the criteria themselves. Some were harder to meet than others. So this is just one way to think about, from the amount of time we put into what are the tasks we want to give to the subject matter experts. 3 simple ratings. Yes, they had to really think about, the content standards and look at the items, but they made 3 simple ratings which gave us a lot of information. And the report that we developed was then sent to the federal government for approval of all 24 tests. Okay, I hinted that I would talk a little bit about artificial intelligence and evaluating and creating alignment. Wouldn't it be great if the computer could replace all the humans and wouldn't have to bring them into a room and we could just get all the alignment information? That's too optimistic, of course, but also, of course, it can help us. So our new best friend, our new tool, generative AI, does have a role here. Here's what we've been playing around with at UMass to link CCRSE, College Career Readiness Standards for Adult Education. And we want to build the test both for the academic standards that I just mentioned and ONET, which is, defines the knowledge and skills that are used in various occupations, various jobs in the United States. So what we've been playing around with is we have some content standards in adult education in one state, like in Texas, for example, and then we have online advertisements to hire people for jobs. We feed that into the engine, and then we want them to, based on learning those similarities, to take what's in ONET, so one way of classifying knowledge and skills in literacy and numeracy, and the academic standards, and see how are they matched. So I can bring in subject matter experts and say, here are the national standards for literacy. Here are the knowledge and skills that are used in various occupations in the workplace. Match those for me. That's a lot of work, right? So what we're trying to do is use artificial intelligence to search through all that text and come up with some matches that will then be validated by the human in the loop. We've started some of this work. We haven't had great success yet, and it really depends on what we're feeding, what we're training the engine on, and I think that's where more work is needed. We do have some examples where people have done that alignment work, and if we can use those data to feed the engine, I think we'll be in a lot better place. Okay, so questions for you. What do you think are the most important validity questions about test content, about test alignment that you think need to be answered? And then what evidence is needed to justify the use of the test for a particular purpose, to say, yes, we have evidence that the content is congruent with that purpose. So if we think about content validity and alignment research, we have different reasons for evaluating alignment. So the goals of an alignment study should be specified, and that will help determine the methods we use. So some questions we might think about: do the test specifications represent the knowledge and skills that we've defined in the curriculum frameworks, in the CEFR, in the domain, or whatever? So that's evaluating the specifications. Now let's look at the test. Do the items sufficiently represent those specifications? Are all items relevant to the curricular domain, to the workplace domain, to whatever domains are targeted? Are there any potential bias against certain types of students? These are all questions, research questions, that require evidence to answer. Is the content sufficient for providing the information that's desired in issuing a certificate or in making some type of action? So a lot of the questions I just described fit into this picture here that we started before: domain representation, domain definition, domain relevance. But there are some additional questions that we can use to, there we go. What about the effect of the curriculum on instruction? So if we have assessments that can measure that change, and is it in the right direction? Are teachers better trained or resourced due to mandated testing? So again, questions more related to washback. So these questions, although they fall into the category of alignment of the whole system of assessment and instruction and learning, we can also think about as validity evidence based on testing consequences. So I'm going to conclude with some thoughts on alignment and content validity, and then I might speed through a couple of things about how we can think about building alignment into an assessment. So with respect to alignment research, as I described so far, It's important for providing evidence regarding the degree to which tests are fulfilling specific purposes, the degree to which we can have confidence in our interpretations about students' performance, and also how we can improve the assessment. If you remember the results I showed you, we would need to go back to the drawing board and have better items measuring speaking. And I just want to point out, this is research that needs to come. The research can be organized and coordinated by the testing agency, but we need to hire independent people to be our subject matter experts, because we need that independent verification to have that confidence. So there's lots of different methods out there. To select the best method, we need to identify the goals, and alignment research is going to be important, as you know, part of quality of the language assessment. So with respect to future directions, we've got artificial intelligence. How can it help us? Not just for looking at a particular test, but how do different tests, either for the same language or even across languages, how aligned are they with what their objectives and content are? And then the idea of content validity and alignment indices for assessment systems rather than for individual tests. This idea of dirty assessment is what we're calling at UMass design in real time. So the assessment doesn't exist until someone sits down, and even having specific items generated for an individual learner that no other learner will see. So the idea of 21st century testing is a more personalized assessment, where the goal is not to develop the best test for most people, but to develop the best test for each individual person. So I like this article that's in Educational Measurement Issues in Practice. Heather Busek talks about personalizing assessment. I've got an article on understandardization, which is changing our conception of standardized testing so that we understand the complexities and the diversity within the population, so that our standardization conditions are flexible enough so that we can really bring in all cultures in a way that values their funds of knowledge. So just as an example, you can have, would you like to take the test? What language would you like to take the test in? But it's not just choice in language of taking the test. Now this is not language testing, this would be science or math or something like that. But we can give, in language assessment, we might give them choice of, do you want to read about history? Do you want to read about politics? We can give different writing prompts that might better match interests. So for example, if we have a reading test, we're trying to measure general academic, trying to measure vocabulary, why give everybody the same reading passage, right? What would you like to read? Would you like to read about critical race theory or sports or food or something else? So you chose sports. We can give choice there too. Would you like to read about UMass football, UMass women's basketball, psychometricians playing ping pong? And then they choose sports. So here's an example. They chose sports. It could be something about UMass. They choose UMass football. So this is a vocabulary item measuring the word tough. If they chose UMass basketball, now they're measuring the word final. So we can think about how do we generate items in a way, and this reminds me of, I can't remember if it was Claudia or Karen's presentation. I think it was Karen's presentations, where we're generating specific linguistic features and specific linguistic complexity, and that gives us the comparability. So, to close, validity evidence based on test content, we need it. We can't have a quality testing program that we feel good about without such evidence. It's not sufficient, but it's necessary. It's a lot of work to do, but there's lots of methods there. I want to thank Alte for the invitation, Maria Angela for all of her help, especially getting these slides there. Please keep in touch. And also, please come to Granada this summer, and we'll continue the conversation there. Grazie.